China says that debt diplomacy does not exist, but they also say that nothing happened in Tiananmen Square, so take that with a grain of salt. In this video, I want to explain to you what is the Chinese debt diplomacy policy. I want to reply to some Chinese talking head points saying that it doesn't exist, it's all a lie. And I also want to warn people about a $100 billion project starting up in Brazil that is completely nonsensical, but should get us very concerned. Now, in summary, what is the debt trap policy used by China? It is finding authoritarian countries that are financially vulnerable, lending them money to finance completely nonsensical projects, or generally just lending them money knowing that it's not going to be paid off, and then when the debt defaults, renegotiating the debt to gain advantages. Now, this could be infrastructure, but it could also be influence. It could also be isolating that country from other potential allies, or generally it could be financing a political party or group that is allied in the country to avoid the country becoming more free and more democratic by financing authoritarianism. They don't actively go after countries and pitch them stupid projects or force them to go into debt or even to go broke. They're just lending people money and then they go bad. That's so sad. Well, that's the same thing as a drug dealer saying, well, I'm not forcing anyone to use drugs. I'm not going door to door knocking. I'm not doing marketing for crack. They just come to buy and I sell it to them. That's not my fault. Now notice, this is a technicality. Me and other critics of China are not claiming that they actually go after the countries. No, they just wait, get pitched projects that don't make sense, wait for countries that are financially unstable to ask them for credit, and then give it to them knowing that this negotiation is not done and something else is going to happen. Now, one of the simplest cases to see this is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka wanted to build a huge new port, completely ignored the advice of private consultants that they hired to help plan and develop the project, then pitched a completely nonsensical and totally different project to the US and India, got refused, and then China financed the project. Now, the port was built for a little over $1 billion. And after a few years, they realized that the port was financially non-viable, as it was told it was. And then a Chinese company got a lease on the port for $1 billion, which they paid the Sri Lanka government, that then paid back Chinese debt, which is the equivalent of a write-off. So a Chinese company, which in the end is controlled by the government of China, got the port, and China, in effect, gave a haircut on their debt. So a debt was given to something that didn't make sense. China gets the infrastructure and the country gets nothing. Again, the Chinese defense is, well, but we didn't force them to do it. No, you didn't. You just waited for stupidity to happen and profited on top of it. Now, another very good example is Zambia. Zambia used to owe $6.6 billion to China. Zambia is a very poor and landlocked country in Africa. And just so you have a sense of the proportion of this debt, it is as if, compared to their GDP, the US owed China $7 trillion. You don't just give out this type and this level of debt to a country without thinking, can they actually pay it back? Now, where did the money go? Well, supposedly to build infrastructure projects, to build roadways, to build a hydroelectrical dam, to build electricity distribution. And the result of that is that Zambia now is just as poor as they were 20 years ago, assuming they are not defrauding their GDP data, assuming their data is completely honest, which is likely not. They got nowhere with this money. Now, that should give us a little bit of pause. How could you throw $6.6 billion in a very poor country and get nothing out of it? I mean, if you just invested randomly, you would assume that at least something would have happened. But no, they got pretty much nothing out of it. And this, again, undermines China's defense of, Well, we're not forcing them to do stupid projects. We're not forcing them to take debt. Look, China wants to pose itself as a nation run by engineers, by very smart people that can use the government to develop the economy and the infrastructure better than the free market. And thus, by state planning and orientation, they can grow a nation better than this evil capitalism. But then when some country comes up with a project, they just turn completely stupid and don't know what works. Like, either you're really smart and you can plan your country better than capitalism, which you can't, or you're completely stupid and you cannot differentiate what is a good and what is a bad project. So at best, China's defense would be, look, we're not evil. We're just dumb. I mean, how could you see all this money going nowhere throughout the years and think, we should keep on loaning them money? This shows that either they're complete morons, which I don't think they are, or they were after something else. They were not after the loans being paid back. They were after something else. And eventually in 2021, Zambia defaulted, a secret renegotiation happened, and China hashed out some sort of deal that obviously is not public. So we know the country got nothing out of it. We know the population got nothing out of it. We can be pretty sure that the politicians got a lot out of it. But what China got out of it? Clearly it wasn't the payback of the deal. So what was it? Now here's another interesting point to think. If the country is highly indebted, it means that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for them to get investment and to get credit from Western countries, meaning that they're pretty much hostages to Chinese credit. By getting them hooked on the financial crack, China makes sure that Zambia is financially isolated and dependent on Chinese credit and investment to go really anywhere. And if it wants to renegotiate its debt, well, first they gotta clear out with the Chinese. But then again, I'm somewhat inclined to also agree with the I'm stupid defense by China because, and you probably don't know this, the per capita GDP of China has essentially not risen since 2021. Now, I'm not saying their full GDP. I'm saying the per capita GDP of China from 2021 to 2024 has risen, by their official numbers, 3.3% over 4 years. That's a lot less than 1% a year. But if you remember that around 30% of their GDP is just accounting fraud, as was demonstrated by an article that did a lot of economic forensics using night lights and how they should grow as the economy grows, but in China they don't, and in a lot of authoritarian countries they don't. If you correct for that, they actually rose only 2.3% in GDP per capita over 4 years. But that costed $5 trillion in debt. Chinese debt went from 11.5 trillion US dollars in 2021 to 16.6 trillion in 2024. So they rose their debt by 50% to get a 2.3% increase in the wealth of their average citizen. So if they want to claim that they're stupid, well, I'm inclined to agree with that somewhat, because that's what happens when you try to have the state planning out the economy. But coming back to the examples, let's look at Montenegro. Now, this is completely unexcusable. China financed the Barbogliari or something like that. Sorry if I butchered the name. Like, it's just, look at that. But they financed $1 billion for Montenegro to build the Barbogliari highway that connects nothing to nowhere. There is no repayment plan. It has virtually no traffic, and even a child could see that this project does not make sense. Now, Montenegro is smaller than my main Portuguese channel. This $1 billion is 20% of their GDP. How would you rationally justify to yourself loaning 20% of the GDP to a country with no plan to pay it back to spend on an painfully obvious, stupid project? There is no way that you were thinking, I'm going to get paid back, or this is rational, or I'm helping. No. But by doing so, they make sure that Montenegro is so highly indebted and is so committed to interest payments on this debt that it's a lot more difficult for them to integrate the European Union. To get into the European Union, there are limits to your deficit, there are limits to what you can do in terms of financial irresponsibility, and by making sure that Montenegro is on the financial crack, China has removed one possible ally from the European Union. Now, assume that Montenegro somehow doesn't pay like 50% of the loan and China somehow gets on the hook for about $500 million. All right. So it took you $500 million to get a country out of the EU, or at least to delay their entry by very many years. So for the cost of 5 F-35 jets, you inflicted significant damage in your geopolitical enemies. That's not a bad deal. There are many other countries where China played its trick, but the last country in this video is Angola. Angola is a very poor and very corrupt country that is a dictatorship ever since they got their independence from Portugal. And they followed the path of the majority of African countries, which is they got screwed by colonialism, and when they got their independence, then they decided to screw themselves over by becoming socialists. So yes, it is a socialist dictatorship for decades now, and China bankrolled them with a loan of $45 billion. Now, how is this paid for? Well, the deal isn't public because, obviously, but what we know is that Angola pays back the loan with oil. Now, we don't know the rate or the price set or what happened, but we can look at what happened to the country. Now, did they get richer off of this? I mean, you get a $45 billion investment. I mean, you're bound to get somewhere, right? Well, if we assume that they're not lying in their data, poverty used to be around 40% of the population in the year 2000. Today, it's 53%. Now, if they're not lying, by their own data, they threw an extra 13% of their population into poverty in roughly 20 years, because this is a 2018 data. We don't have any recent data because they don't care to collect those data, because obviously it's going to be really bad. But if you think that they're lying, then it's actually even worse. Now, how do you invest $45 billion in a very poor country and get more poverty is a mystery worthy of many studies. But what we can conclude from looking into the few statistics that they have is that in almost every single one of them, Angola today is worse than they were 20 years ago. So where did that money go? Well, the simple answer is the politicians. Another answer is the Angolan dictatorship is responsible for stirring up other socialistic, let's say, movements around Africa and fueling corruption and other activities, if you know what I'm saying, in other countries. So maybe the money went that way. Maybe it just went away into the politicians. But we know it didn't go for the people, and we know it didn't go towards investing in infrastructure in the country because they're just as backwards as they were 2 decades ago. So what is China's part in this loan? The best case that you could make is they bought some really cheap oil at the cost of not thinking about how a politically corrupt structure is exploiting tens of millions of people, which is essentially colonialism at this point. Like, that's the best argument you could ever make. But when you kind of think about it a little bit more, well, they also help to finance, to back, to prop up, and to expand the power of a socialist dictatorship in Africa. And being that China is a socialist dictatorship, it is in their interests to fuel authoritarian regimes in Africa to avoid democracy and freedom. Because if you're pumping up tens of billions of dollars into left-wing dictatorships and assuming that the freedom budget in Africa is not anywhere near that value, well, then you're ensuring that the continent will remain poor, socialistic, and authoritarian. Although, I mean, what's the difference, right? And here we can rebut a last claim of the Chinese government and their talking heads, that is, they're just lending to countries where Western standards were too tight. They demanded, they interfered too much in the country, demanding many changes so they would give their loans, which is a violation of their sovereignty. Well, yes, the West, banks, investors, development banks, the International Monetary Fund, they're going to demand a few changes like fighting corruption, transparency, institutions, some idea that there is going to be an economic development in the country, which would mean that the poor people are going to be, I'm not even going to say rich, but maybe like less poor, and that would provide the conditions where you would pay the loan, right? I mean, that feels like you're not asking too much, right? So if the country has not complied with these conditions, then why is China lending to them? If credit is not going to those countries, it's because either it's not a good idea, or because it's all going to be diverted, or a combination of all things bad. So if China still looks at all of this and says, let's pour tens of billions of dollars into those countries, they're not getting those things out. They're getting something else. Or they would have to play the I'm stupid defense and say that they have no idea how to invest maybe hundreds of billions of dollars in the world, and they happen to just get shafted in pretty much everything, and they still keep doing it for reasons of vibes. Which leads me to my last point, that is, China is inking up a deal with Brazil to build a completely nonsensical railroad crossing the entirety of Brazil, parts of the Amazon, into Peru, into the Peruvian Amazon forest, and then through the Andes to connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean with a railroad to supposedly help to send agricultural products from Brazil and raw ores and maybe that type of stuff into Peru, which is going to reduce by maybe like 10 or 15 days the shipping time from Brazil to China, which, I mean, just the whole thing of reducing the time could make sense, but then you have to think, look, this is going to cost $100 billion. Like, can't you think of like something else to do with it? And turns out that Brazil had a legislation to aid private investment in railways in the country. And when that happened, we raised roughly $50 billion in private investment to develop railroads in Brazil. Not a cent, not one single investor was interested in this railroad. So when there was the option to build it, nobody cared. And the country clearly did not have a problem in raising investment for railroads. So we know just there that the investment doesn't make sense, unless Qin Jinping wants to say to me that he knows more about building railroads in Brazil than the people who build railroads in Brazil and actually ship out the grain and ores. I mean, like, maybe you should just figure something out. I don't know. Or it could be that the project is just something else. Why would China be interested in throwing $100 billion into a project that is completely nonsensical, that surely would never be completed and may not even start? But what's the point of that? Like, I mean, it could just be bravado. It could just be, marketing, vibes, feelings, memes. I don't know. But if you're actually going to follow through with that, let me just remind you that the current president of Brazil, Lula, served jail time for a huge corruption scandal where companies that built public works and state-owned companies were victims of corruption, and at least billions of dollars, but maybe in the tens of billions of dollars, were diverted to political parties and other corrupt intermediaries who made the whole thing work. Now, part of that money was recovered, part of the money just went away, but the point is that those guys have experience in using public works to divert huge amounts of money into politics. And it just so happens that Lula's party is a left-wing party. But here's the thing, this corruption scheme by Lula and his party was not limited to Brazil. The investigation reached 48 countries. Connections with this corruption scheme were found in most Latin American countries and a few African countries. This was not a corruption scheme to enrich politicians. This was a corruption scheme to help finance the campaigns and further the power and influence of left-wing, authoritarian, socialistic governments who wanted to implement authoritarian governments in their countries. So why would China make a $100 billion commitment to building a nonsensical public work in Brazil? Well, because maybe they know that the money is going somewhere else, right? But I don't know, maybe China just couldn't figure out a better way to spend $100 billion other than trying to yeet soy over the Andes or under us somehow, I don't know. But the point is, this is just one project. There are hundreds of projects out there in tens of countries in the world, mostly in Africa and in South Asia, where China is financing nonsense, where the countries will end up just as poor, if not worse off than they were in the beginning. And authoritarian, socialistic, and corrupt governments are getting billions of dollars into their pockets to keep on doing the evil they do. China is not financing this to get money. China is financing this to get a less free world. And we need to know that this is happening.